Welcome to the History Politics Podcast, putting the past to work from UCLA's Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Hello, this is David Myers, Director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy and host of today's podcast. On this episode, we're going to delve into the world of American cultural and countercultural history by exploring the life and legacy of one of the country's most iconic bands, the Grateful Dead. In its remarkable 60-year career, the Dead has been present at and contributed to key moments of change in the United States, beginning with its origins in beat-era San Francisco. The band's lead guitarist, Jerry Garcia, was one of the most beloved, enigmatic, and confounding personalities of American popular culture, and the band's followers, known as Deadheads, have created their own distinctive style of dress, dance, and listening that has been transmitted from generation to generation. To help us understand where the Dead came from, why it was so distinctive, and what its long and strange trip tells us about America, I'm pleased to welcome Jim Newton, who teaches at UCLA and edits the UCLA magazine Blueprint. Jim is a veteran journalist who worked at the LA Times for 25 years, including as columnist and bureau chief. He is also the acclaimed author of 4 works on California political history. But recently, Jim has shifted gears and produced an exceptional piece of American cultural history, Here Beside the Rising Tide, Jerry Garcia, The Grateful Dead, and an American Awakening. So tell us, what's your own origin story with the Grateful Dead?
I guess there's probably 2 that are worth mentioning. Personally, I started going to Dead shows in the 70s. I grew up in Palo Alto. I went to high school in Palo Alto where they had come from, so they were very much still in the air. But really, the Dead show that first impressed me as something worth writing about was the US Festival in 1982. And there, it was really, that's the first time I really noticed and appreciated the culture around the Dead, the crowd, the Deadheads, partly because it was in contrast, so starkly in contrast to the rest of the US Festival that weekend. It was called Breakfast with the Dead, in fact. So that's one piece of it. That's my sort of entry into the band and its music. Professionally, though, as you know, I write mostly about politics and culture in California, and everything I had written, pretty much everything I had written up to this point, had been politics and culture of California. This time I thought to do culture and politics, to sort of reverse that idea. That took me a while professionally kind of to get to, having gone through or done some other books. So I had to kind of work my way to this as a book project, but it's something that I've been thinking about in one way or another really since 1982. So it took me a while to do it.
Well, I mean, in some sense, you're a scholar of many things, but if I think of the Warren and the Brown books, and what lies in between them, you're an expert on California in the 60s and 70s, this extraordinarily generative period. And I'm just wondering it seems almost too obvious to say as almost a child of that period. What draws you to that era of California history, life, and society?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit an accident to have come upon it. The Warren book took me to the edge of it, but Warren, of course, left California to become Chief Justice in the 50s, so he's really not there for that part of the story. So when I finished the Warren book, I felt this kind of yearning to get back to California, and to finish that story. The Jerry Brown book gave me the opportunity to cover some of that ground, but the Jerry Brown book left me feeling like there was so much culture happening in California that I was really only able to hint at in that book because I wanted to stay focused on him. And he's not properly thought of, I think, as a counterculture figure exactly. He's sort of on the periphery of it. So I felt like it was a little bit, the material sort of fell between the cracks of a couple of projects. So there was that. But also, as I mentioned, I spent my high school years in Palo Alto. Silicon Valley, the aftermath, sort of the hate and everything that had happened there was this feeling that something very big was happening. And some of it was technology, and some of it was culture and music, some of it was politics. And I guess what I would say is my previous work hadn't ever allowed me to dive right into that. I felt like I had nibbled the edges of it, but never quite gotten to the meat of it.
Mm. And tell us what your sense is of the unique alchemy of the Grateful Dead, that has been such a unique experiment. The longevity is astonishing. But
Yeah.
also, as we were talking about just before we started recording, the remarkable eclecticism. So, how do you understand that alchemy, that combination of incredible musicianship, social norms and their recreation, and the incredible lyrics of so
Yeah.
many songs?
Yeah, and all of that woven together in ways that are hard to disentangle. I mean, start with sort of time and place, I guess. Grateful Dead comes into being in 1965, 1966 in California in the Bay Area. I don't think the Grateful Dead happens at a different time or a different place. I mean, I don't think the Grateful Dead can't come out of Oklahoma City, or Burlington, Vermont, or can't come into existence in 1980 or 1950. So there is a kind of confluence of things that allows the audience and the band to develop simultaneously and with each other. And in that vein, what I would say is the acid tests, I think, are a very important part of understanding how the dead came to life, so to speak, and also how it affected their relationship with their audience. So the acid tests are these series of LSD experiments rather, at a time I should note when LSD was still legal, where the Dead performed at them, but they weren't Dead shows. The band was still very young. It had just changed its name from the Warlocks to the Grateful Dead. Um, they came, they played, they put their instruments down for a while. They participated. People didn't come to see the band. They came to sort of enjoy each other, and members of the band were part of that. They paid admission just like everyone else did. Um, so they weren't really the center of attention. And I think that idea, that sort of casualness in their relationship with their audience carried over even into the late days when there were 50,000 people there clearly to see the Grateful Dead. But the idea that they were not separated entirely from the audience is important to understanding what they felt about the experience. And I think also goes some ways to explaining the loyalty that Deadheads have that's unlike anything else to any other musical act that I'm aware of. So I think you put the different musical styles, the Dead's experimental quality, the commitment to improvisation, drugs, the Bay Area, 1965, the politics of it, all of that somehow, add a dash of cayenne and a little salt and pepper, and then you've got it, right? It's hard. It is hard, though, to take out any one of those ingredients and know what it would have looked like. Mountain Girl, Jerry's longest, the woman to whom he was married the longest or with the longest, said to me as we were talking about this book that the Dead were like the rennet, as she said, which is something I hadn't heard of until then. But that's the coalescing agent in cheese, which who knew? But her point was there's this giant culture cheese around them, but they had something to do with sort of pulling it all together, and that's as good and as close a description as I've come up with.
Well,
So.
that's great. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just so important to emphasize that going to a Dead concert is not just about listening to the music. It is a social scene. And what you remind us is that it was a social scene from the very first moment, from its inception.
Even arguably even a social moment before it was a concert. So they sort of backed into being a performing act. They really started as part of a social experiment.
Yeah. I mean, and just to capture that moment and the social scene, and for that matter, the cultural scene, there's an incredible picture in the book that I'm looking at right now of a group of um, uh, people of the 60s, musicians gathered at 710 Ashbury,
Oh yeah.
the Dead's house, that includes members of the Grateful Dead, Quicksilver Messenger Service, Janis Joplin and Big Brother, Jefferson Airplane, and the Charlatans all gathered together on the steps. And you just have this sense that this was either the preface to the prelude or the aftermath of a long party that included extended jam sessions and probably ingestion of many different kinds of drugs, principally LSD. And it really captures that scene.
Yeah. Yeah. Someone said to me along the course of this reporting that, or wrote somewhere that I read that there were sometimes it was described as the San Francisco music or the San Francisco sound more often. That's a little bit misleading because those bands all had very distinctive sounds. But the San Francisco scene was real. That they performed on each other's albums. Jerry himself produced albums for others. He famously played the steel guitar on Teach Your Children for Crosby, Stills and Nash. So there's an enormous amount of interplay between those bands. Not so much in terms of musical style, but just in their social. They liked each other. They supported each other. That's a real scene. That scene, hey, it got too big and it sort of outgrew itself and got very chaotic. But particularly in the early months of it, it was really, I think, for Garcia, really a highlight moment of his life, frankly.
So one of the things that makes the Dead is not only this unique blend of musical talent, Jerry Garcia on lead guitar, Bob Weir, rhythm guitar, vocals, the classically trained Phil Lesh and the two drummers,
Hmm.
Mickey and Bill, but the lyricists,
Yeah.
Robert Hunter and John Perry Barlow. I wonder if you could say a word about them and their import to the
Yeah.
phenomenon
Well,
known as the
Hunter
Grateful
in
Dead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. Both very important, both highly gifted. It's easy, I think, to overlook Barlow just because Hunter is such a dominant lyricist in the band. But that's only to say, I mean, to be the second best lyricist for the Grateful Dead is like being the second best player on the Yankees at their in their heyday, right? I mean, he was a gifted lyricist and wrote mostly for Bob Weir. Um, I think what they captured, Hunter in particular, was that very subtle place in which they write about the ineffable and the big and the cosmic while also giving you those intimate real life details. Very rarely writing about current events. Garcia had a real aversion to being too on the nose. And in fact, there's a few Dead lyrics that he amended over time to make them a little more opaque. But the essence of those lyrics is there is something elusive about them that allows different people to hear them differently. I've certainly had the experience of hearing them differently over time. They can seem to refer to something in the news, but then viewed from a different direction, seem to be about something entirely different. That's a real gift of a poet. And Hunter was enormously gifted, and I think Barlow was quite gifted. And so both of them, it's actually, I should add, a little bit of a challenge to write about Garcia because you want to impute to him those lyrics when he didn't actually write them. And so the sentiments that are being expressed by them, certainly he's comfortable with, he's singing them, and sometimes he's editing them, but they didn't really come from his pen. So that is
Right. And
for
these are
me, a
both
complicated
poets.
part
These are
about it.
both poets possessed of a huge literary reservoir. I mean,
Absolutely.
capable of drawing on allusions from English literature for 1,000 years. Really
Yeah.
astounding in the range. And that is integrated into the lyrics as well as the references to the train culture of the 19th century
Right.
and taking drugs in the 20th century. It's really that amalgam that makes for such a unique lyrical experience.
And they feel timeless as a result, which may be part of why they do, in fact, wear so well with time, that they're not rooted in a particular event or moment, but they
Right. The,
feel
the
tied to the
obverse of
very
that,
large culture.
the obverse of that is, as you note at length, they're not topical. They're not on the nose, as you said. They're not an exceptionally or even significantly political band in a highly
Agreed.
political time. And that's sort
Agreed.
of the interesting juxtaposition. This is 1966. Ronald Reagan is elected governor of California. Counterculture is turning political. With the war becoming more and more ominous. The free speech
Yeah.
movement is taking rise in the very state. Ronald Reagan provides that counterweight, and the band resists that political pull.
Yeah. Yeah. The band's relationship to politics is fascinating. It's the Jerry did not consider himself a political person, as I'm sure you know. The band did not consider itself political. Now, I think it's safe to say that most of those around the band, in the band, and certainly in the larger Dead community skew heavily to the left. Not entirely, but heavily. Um, but you don't see the Grateful Dead doing fundraisers, endorsing candidates. They don't participate in politics in the way that Joan Baez say did and does, or that others in the 60s did or have since. And yet, I would also make the argument that there is an inherent politics in them. They are expressing values, they're living values. One way I think to think of the many factions of the counterculture is to think about the difference between radicals and bohemians. And one way to think about that is a radical is someone who's very much trying to change your mind, right? Trying to change the world and the way you look at it, and is evangelical in that sense. A bohemian is someone who I think is living a set of values, but may not be preaching those values and really wants to be left alone to pursue those values. And to the extent that those values have any appeal beyond the immediate circle, any evangelical value, it is by their gift of attraction, right? There's the model of them. That's where I would place the Dead and Jerry in this, is that
Right.
they
I'm just
clearly
wondering.
had a sense of values.
Yeah, I mean the lineage. I mean it draws upon the culture of hippies, the culture of the Beats,
Definitely.
which is very much a culture, and it's about culture. It's about the reimagination of culture.
Yeah.
There seems to be a parallel political tradition that is,
Mhm.
as you describe it, a progressive slash radical tradition that
Mhm.
often intersects. Those parallel lines meet over time, but one, as you actually successfully traced that cultural lineage of the Dead back to the Caseys
Yeah.
and the Beats of an earlier time.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right. And I remember as a kid, someone saying to me that the only place you could go and expect to meet a Black Panther and a Hell's Angel would be a Dead show. And so, I mean, they were, again, at the center of that geographically and philosophically, but also positioned themselves as comfortable with all of that. And so their politics are hard to pigeonhole by kind of our modern definitions of them, but they were an expression of their creativity, their commitment to freedom, that commitment to community. Those all have political valence, even if they are not electoral politics.
Yeah, I mean, help us understand that social scene, the Dead show, where the Hell's Angel, the Flower Girl, the Spinner, and the Black Panther
Yeah.
can somehow coexist.
I think it is a space to be free, but it is not freedom in the kind of Western individual tradition of freedom, right? It's a freedom, it's a community freedom. It's a refuge, and it's a place to be with others and be free, to experience. Someone said to me, it's a place to experience bliss collectively rather than in a solitary way. And that again, I think is a value that's easy to pigeonhole to the 60s, but in fact present in our lives today. I think a lot of people yearn for that. And so, yes, it is a place to get away from certain aspects of culture that feel oppressive, a place to express them with others who want to feel that too. And I think one of the reasons the Grateful Dead became so huge in the 1980s is it was one of the few places where people could go. In the 1960s, there were a lot of places you could go for that kind of outlet. By the 80s, when Reagan is now president and Grateful Dead are no longer just a California band, the Grateful Dead and Dead shows became a place to hide out from Reaganism and from what people felt was an oppressive, insensitive culture.
So at the center of that universe stands the cosmically significant personality of Jerry Garcia, whom you uh, follow very carefully in the course of the book, from his humble origins to his ignominious decline,
Mhm.
uh, owing to drug addiction. Um, and yet, I must confess, throughout, Jerry remains an enigma. Um, you know, a countercultural figure of world historical significance and decidedly apolitical. Um, a man of great musical expression and yet relatively few words, it would seem, in certainly in the public sense.
Mhm.
Um, a person who believed in sort of the democracy of performance and exposing the public to the music, and yet who was not especially enthralled with the stage, and in fact suffered from stage fright uh,
Hmm.
late in the day.
Hmm.
What's your epitaph for Jerry Garcia?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think you've summed him up quite well there, both enigmatic and contradictory in some ways, right? Those some of what you just described, it doesn't seem like it would fit together in the same body. I mean, I think the standout features of Garcia for me are an obsessive commitment to his work and his craft, a genius for it, um, a ravenously curious intellect, musically and otherwise, just eager to absorb strains of culture. In fact, you can make the argument that there's no band that better coalesces American musical genres into one act than the Grateful Dead, and that's because of Garcia. And also someone who was chronically afraid of responsibility, and really resisted any attempt to make him responsible for almost anything. His his marriages. He was not a good companion to his wives. He was an on again, off again father to his daughters. Which is not to say he didn't love them. He did. I think there's no doubt about it. But his commitment to music was close to absolute, and it came at the expense of personal relationships. And then finally, I think the thing I would add to his makeup is drugs. Drugs which started as something that he saw as creatively helpful to him, LSD and marijuana, felt he and other members of the Dead and many other people as a kind of gateway into understanding new conscious levels of consciousness. Over time, that segued into heroin and cocaine, which did not do that for any of them. Instead, heroin in particular grabbed him by the throat. It didn't take him over instantaneously, and there's a long period of him kind of bumping in and out of using. But by the end, it robbed him of what might have been the thing that mattered most to him, which is being able to perform capably as a musician with other musicians and enjoy it and be part of a community. Instead, he became terribly isolated, and he died at age 53. So it's a tragic story on top of everything else. I think also an enlightening and uplifting story. But and I don't know. I don't know what Jerry Garcia in his 70s or 80s would have been doing, or whether we'd be enjoying it. He put down a lot of work by the age 53, so maybe he had done all he needed to do. But it is certainly true that drugs cut short his life and cut short the meaningfulness of his life even before they killed him.
Who else interests you in the band? I mean, one could do a discrete episode on every single person in the band. In fact, shows have been devoted to each of them. But I'm curious, in your own rendering, who else interests you? I mean, there's obviously the Bobby Jerry dynamic,
Yeah.
but I'm just wondering what stands out to you as particularly interesting musically or otherwise.
Yeah, well, I would say this is a slight dodge to your question, but I do think that they work because each of them brings a different kind of musical background to it, and so it is in the amalgamation that they are special, and so it's a little hard to separate any of them out of that. I mean, someone said to me early in this that the three great geniuses of the Grateful Dead were Jerry Garcia, Robert Hunter, and Phil Lesh, each of them. And Phil is particularly unusual in that respect because Phil joined the Dead as its bass player before he knew how to play the bass. He was really there just because of his interestingness to Jerry
He
and
was a
his
violin
attention.
player?
He was a piano player. He was
Piano
a
player.
composer, really, a classical composer. And he agreed to join the Dead if Jerry would teach him how to play the bass, which Jerry, I guess, did well. And as a result, though, he's a very unconventional bass player, was a very unconventional bass player. The one thing I would add to that, Bobby is a real fun figure to me. I've never met him. I've seen him, of course, a million times, and now most recently with Dead and Company. I really enjoyed seeing Bob Weir with Dead and Company because I spent my whole growing up thinking of him as kind of Jerry's kind of kooky younger brother
Yeah,
figure, right? He was the
exactly.
one kind of rock star figure
Yeah,
in the band.
yeah.
His post Grateful Dead life is now as long as
Oh
his
my
Grateful Dead
gosh.
life was.
So, Jim, how did you take the news of Bobby's passing on January 10th at age 78?
Yeah, it was definitely sad and sobering. I learned of it in a text actually from my editor on the book, Ben Greenberg at Random House. Um, and just along with the sadness of seeing someone you've known or been around, I never knew him personally, but go, there is that sense I feel, and I know you do too, of something ending. And now, of course, Bill Kreutzmann is still alive, Mickey Hart is still alive. It's not really the end of the living members of the Grateful Dead, but it does feel like the end of the musical enterprise of that phase of that musical enterprise anyway.
Yeah, it
Which
does. It does seem that that marks the end of the extraordinary chapter known as the Grateful Dead.
yeah.
And I wonder, at that moment, at this moment, how do you assess his legacy in the history of the band?
As a member of the Grateful Dead, I thought of him as a little bit of a sidekick for most of the years that I was seeing the band. That began to change, though, I would say, in the later years of the band, especially as Jerry's health declined. Bobby became a bigger and bigger stage presence. He's the only member of the Grateful Dead that had anything that one would associate with a stage personality, right? He did sometimes feel like a rock star trapped in a non-rock and roll band. But he was fun. He was active and jumping around and enjoying himself while the other members could be sort of out of it. So he was always an appealing member of the Grateful Dead. That in his second iteration, though, in the post-Dead career, it really felt to me like he became the kind of keeper of the flame, right? He kept it alive, kept something alive. He was the connection back to the original. And have loved Dead and Company, not as a continuation of the Dead, but as a kind of a tending of the fire of the Dead. And Bobby was the essential ingredient of that. He became the soul center of that band in a way that he was always a little bit off center in the Grateful Dead itself because Jerry was there. So
What?
I came to really like him and appreciate him even more, I think, in the post-Dead years.
Mhm. Going back to phase one, maybe we'll push on
Yeah.
to phase two at some point. What would you say about their sort of blending of guitar styles of
hmm
Jerry on lead and Bobby as, one of the most accomplished and acclaimed rhythm guitarists? What
Yeah.
did that do for you?
It's funny. There's a moment in fairly early in the life of the Dead where Phil and Jerry moved to push Pigpen and Bobby out of the band.
Yeah.
And it would have been a cat.
Which you
Yeah,
discuss.
it's in the book. And oddly, it was tape recorded, so there's a tape of it. Um, and it would have been a catastrophic mistake for the Dead. And of course, it didn't stick. So it's good news for everyone. But I think it would have been a mistake mainly because Bobby and then Pigpen, who died not long after, but brought their musical sensibilities to the Dead. And the thing that makes the Dead special, in my view, is that it doesn't favor one musical genre over another, that it's really about the sort of collecting of those musical influences. And Bobby brought a jug band country music sensibility to the whole thing that had that disappeared, I think it could have become too esoteric and weird, it was grounding. He was a performer. He loved performing. I mean, and he can make a credible case for having performed before more people than any person ever, really. That the case was made for Jerry at the time of his death, and Bobby did 30 years more performances. So, there's not
I
a
mean,
lot.
he's such a curious cultural foil to Jerry as well. I mean, you
Yeah.
mentioned that, the country vibe as opposed to Jerry's classic hippie profile. Um, Jerry was, as you chronicle, kind of religiously anti-political. Bobby was more
Mhm.
inclined to speak his mind, especially in later years.
Yeah.
They made for, a really fascinating pair that was part of the unique dynamic that lent the Grateful Dead its incredible oomph, its
Yeah.
staying power.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they're a great band if they're five identical musicians, really. What makes them interesting is that they are different from each other. Phil is a classically trained, Bobby is the country guy. Each of them brings this kind of set of ideas with them, and it wouldn't have the balance that it had without him, either in terms of the showmanship or in terms of the musical underpinnings of it. So he's an absolutely essential ingredient of the Grateful Dead from the first day.
And the corpus of Bobby's songs is an impressive one.
Yeah.
Jack Straw Cassidy, trucking, playing the band, Terrapin Station. What do you say about that corpus, and what's your favorite Bobby song?
Well, I have a dog named Sugar after Sugar Magnolia, so I feel like I'm obliged to say that.
I didn't even mention perhaps the most famous of them, Sugar Magnolia. Yeah.
Yeah, well, which is an interesting one too, because it's the only one he co-wrote with Hunter, and they actually had a little bit of a fallout over it. Um, yeah, all of those songs that you mentioned, those would be the standout piece of music of any other musical act, right? And they fit neatly into the Dead's larger work. I would say that the Bobby Barlow songs tend to be less elliptical, a little less uh, uh, broad and allegorical. They don't draw on the same kind of literary references that Robert Hunter did, but they're strong and rhythmic and Barlow, especially as the years went by, I think became a really a quality lyricist. So they're great pieces of music, and Bobby loved performing them. And they created together. A lot of them have a kind of Western country tinge to them, Mexicali blues, Jack Straw, as you mentioned. So they round out that piece of the Dead's musical portfolio, I would say.
And let's say the dead is the necessary condition for their success. Deadheads are the sufficient condition for their success.
Yeah.
When do we first come into consciousness of the phenomenon known as deadheads?
Yeah. Deadheads start very early. And that's interesting too, right? I mean, it didn't take 20 years for there to be this loyal following around the Dead. There were really Deadheads almost from the get-go. And and there still are. I'm not exaggerating when I say I just this last week signed a book for the daughter of a friend of mine who's 22 years old and thinks of herself as a deadhead. And it's like, I just think it's magnificent. It's
Timelessness of it.
It's astonishing. Then the question is why, right? Like, I went to these Dead and Company shows in San Francisco last summer. 60,000 people a night, Polo Field in San Francisco. I would say at least half to two-thirds of the people there are too young to have ever seen Jerry. And yet right there, paying whatever they're paying a night to see Dead and Company, and loving every minute of it. So I've sort of stumbled around a lot for explanations as to why that would be. I would offer just a couple thoughts. None of them is a full explanation. One, I do think the eclectical musical style gives something for everyone. And there is something about the fact that every show is different, means you can come night after night and not be bored by the same set list. So that I think that's the essential ingredient. But beyond that, I do think there is a yearning to be happy with other people at a time when there are not all too few opportunities to do that. That has a kind of political feel to it, even though it's definitely not a political rally. But I think at a time when our politics deprives us of that, that's something that politics used to help fill in us, right? We go to a political rally, you could go to a demonstration, you could feel like you were working with others and experiencing something joyfully with others. There's some of those opportunities now, but not in the same way. And so I think the music, the culture, and that very ancient desire to be joyful with others. I think that expresses itself now too. And deadheads have that. I mean, you don't have to be a deadhead to recognize that other people have that in that experience. And so that's real,
I often wonder if, in terms of a political identity, to the extent that we could affix one to Jerry and the Dead and maybe deadheads, it may be that a kind of American libertarianism, live and let live, is the guiding ethos. It's a kind of cultural sensibility, maybe more than a political sensibility.
Yeah.
But it often seems like that may be where Jerry was at.
Yeah, I mean, and there are some conservatives or libertarians who find that sucker in the Dead. I mean, Jerry himself owned handguns, right? I mean, there is a kind of Western libertarianism. If you look at the album cover to Working Man's Dead, it's a sort of Western pastiche. So yes, I do think that you can find that. And the lyrics, again, are elliptical enough to find that in there. I would say a slight caution on that. You don't see the Grateful Dead show performing for the National Rifle Association, right? I mean, it is, I do think that the dominant Dead culture skews progressive. And with the deadheads who identify as conservatives are the exception, not the rule. And they
Yeah.
have to, I think you have to strain it a little bit to get there. But there is that ethos that you're describing, that libertarian
Yeah,
ethos.
that Western
Yeah.
libertarian sensibility, perhaps not defined in cultural rather than political terms. But I
Agreed.
do often wonder what the composition, how the crowd at a Denko show would vote. And I'm kind of always landing at 70-30.
Yeah. I think
Not
that's
not
about right.
90-10, which
Yeah.
one might assume going in.
Hunter Thompson once said that you could change this country if you could just get every deadhead to vote. So I wish they would.
Um, so I just want to dwell for a minute on the musical eclecticism. We were talking
Yeah.
about this a little bit before we started. I mean, you could identify bluegrass, country, American folk, rock and roll, rockabilly, and jazz. I mean, you mentioned the fact that a number of jazz greats, Miles Davis, Ornette Coleman, were all enamored of the Grateful Dead.
Yeah. I mean, I would say what the jazz, the biggest part of the jazz influence on the Dead is the way they play as opposed to what they play. And that is just that determination to make every night different, that willingness to follow the sound where it leads. Sometimes, and I will let me confess, sometimes into kind of dead ends. I've been to a couple of Dead shows where there was there were some sort of snafu moments. And I'm sorry, this goes back to your earlier question about Deadheads. One thing that Deadheads really gave the Dead is the ability to do that, right? I mean, I never heard anyone leave a show saying, "Oh, I want my money back," or "That was terrible," right? It was a ride, and part of that was the willingness to make mistakes and try things, and just sort of fall over on them. But that is a bit of an extrapolation, I think, from the jazz. Fondness. Jerry was very enamored of Ornette Coleman, as you mentioned. They performed on the same bill as Miles Davis in San Francisco, very much admired each other. It was Phil was just astonished by being there with Miles Davis. So I think that desire, willingness, eagerness to play music that required them to listen to each other and play off each other, that's the biggest part of the jazz influence, I would say, and that is the way that they saw each other as a unit. And it's one of the most exciting things about the music, is what makes it so fresh night after night.
Yeah, that improvisatorial spirit that
Yeah.
now John Mayer brings to the corpus as the lead guitarist for Dead and Company, which
Yeah.
is one of the successor bands, the most successful successor band of the Grateful Dead, 30 years after the Dead's last show. So how can we understand this afterlife?
Yeah. I Someone asked me recently, does it ever end? And in one sense, I think there's probably a moment in the not too distant future where it changes, which is to say the surviving members of the Grateful Dead will someday have to stop performing. But does the music end? Does the culture end? I don't think so. I mean, thousands of bands, more than I can imagine or count, perform the music of the Grateful Dead day after day, night after night. It has a life that is independent of any of its performers. And the culture, I think, draws on some very ancient yearnings in humanity. So I don't think those go away either. I suspect it'll look different. It already looks different than it did when Jerry
And
was.
sounds.
And sounds different.
John Mayer.
John Mayer, I think the great genius thing that John Mayer has done is to not try to copy Garcia.
Yeah.
He is his own, he's a brilliant guitar player, in some ways maybe better technically than Jerry.
Yeah.
It doesn't to me have the same deep soulfulness that the Garcia work did, but it has something else. And that something else is, I compare it to the imitation hamburger meat, right? Like if you taste it thinking you're wanting hamburger, then it tastes kind of weird. But if you just taste it on its own, it tastes great. And I think John Mayer has done a really great job of freshening and modernizing that, and not trying to appropriate it.
Yeah, yeah, and his connection to the keyboardist Jeff
Right.
is a beautiful thing to see.
Fun to watch. Yeah.
So, as you assess the import and the longevity of this remarkable cultural phenomenon, what do you think it tells us about America, about American culture, American social norms? What can we learn from the Grateful Dead about the United States?
Well, I think one thing we can learn about ourselves in the United States is that it's good to be true to your values. And that doesn't mean that they can't change or evolve over time, but a commitment to values will see you through some dark places. And I think that was true for the Dead more than any band that came out of that San Francisco scene or out of that era stayed true to itself. There's a funny press conference at one point where a reporter asks, "Have the Grateful Dead sold out?" And Jerry just says, "Yep." And later he said, "Well, we've been trying to sell out all this time, but nobody will buy." He's a very self-deprecating interview, which is part of what makes him fun. But yeah, they enjoyed who they were. They didn't change to meet the fashion, and I think there's something to be learned from that. I think another thing that I would take away from the Dead, and this goes back to our conversation about the politics of the Dead, Jerry's life to me has within it important reminders that the government can control certain things about you. It can control your liberty, and sadly your body on occasion, but it cannot control your heart or your feelings or your creative inner soul. And Garcia took that so seriously that he didn't regard the government as meaningful in his life at all, which the couple times he got arrested may have reminded him that that's not true. But there is something to learn from that too, that there is a limit to the government's authority on any of us. And that's true even in the face of the most repressive governments. That's difficult to exercise at times, but I think it is worth remembering that we have all of us within us a place that is immune to changes in administration or policy, that we are and can be and should be ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a beautiful way to end, although I do have one more question.
Wait, no.
Because I'm just thinking of the role that jazz has played as a culture of resistance in Nazi Germany, in post-war communist Eastern Europe. Milan Kundera, the great Czech writer, wrote at great length about jazz as a culture of resistance. And in some sense, the Dead are a culture of resistance, while at the same time being deeply woven into the American cultural mainstream at this point. My last question is unfair. It's kind of asking you to name your favorite Beatle, or this way, or in this sense, member of the Grateful Dead, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to ask you to just say a word about your favorite Dead song, or what comes to mind as a favorite.
Choosing your favorite children, right? But well, Uncle John's Band has real meaning. That's why it's in the title. The title borrows from Uncle John's Band. I think as an expression of American sort of cultural a piece of Americana, it's my favorite. But the song that I think speaks most to my heart is Ripple. That line, "If I knew the way I would take you home," is something I have been thinking about since I was in my 20s. And it's meant different things to me at different times in my life. But it plays a role in the ending of the book as I try to reflect on it there. I would say if I had to choose one, and I do resist a little bit having to choose one, but it's probably the one that has spoken to me the most deeply over the longest time.
That's a great response, Jim. Jim Newton, author of Here Beside the Rising Tide, Jerry Garcia, The Grateful Dead, and An American Awakening. A wonderful, wonderful book. Thank you so much for making time to be with us.
A real pleasure, David. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the History Politics podcast, Putting the Past to Work, from UCLA's Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.